Using a photodiode to measure the power of a laser can be challenging because the output can saturate and the response of the photodiode is highly wavelength dependent. Nevertheless, photodiodes are useful tools for measuring laser power, particularly when the power level is small, below a milliwatt or so. When setting up a photodetector for a power measurement, we need to make sure the detector's active area is much larger than the beam that it's measuring. If the active region of the detector is the same beam width, we'll only capture about 86% of the power of a Gaussian beam, with the tails of the beam falling off the detector. But at 3 times the beam width, a detector